Federal power must be reconciled with federal duty, and the best way to achieve that reconciliation is to demand the justification of any government regulation that infringes upon or denies Aboriginal rights. The effect of Section 35(1) on Section 9124 of the Constitution Act 1867. The water crisis in Canada is a self-inflicted epidemic that needs provincial and national recognition. The current status of inadequate water quality in many communities across Canada is a long-term result of an attempt to manage the First Nations communities as a problem rather than offer them the treatment as equal residents of Canada. The water crisis is one of the many issues that Indigenous communities are facing today, but it is representative of the relationship that these communities have with the federal and provincial governments. The negligence that exists is not only unconstitutional on a national level, but it collides with the international laws regarding Aboriginal communities that the majority of the world has recognized. While some regulations may exist, there is a lack of enforcement in many different aspects of Indigenous life. While this would have at one point been the preferred approach of Indigenous interaction with the Canadian government, many Aboriginal communities are in a position today that requires external assistance from the government. As a long-term result of colonialism, the majority of Indigenous communities in Canada are no longer self-sufficient. Indigenous communities are no longer self-sufficient due to a long-term result of colonialism. In forcing the Indigenous communities to assimilate into Canadian society, it eradicated the holistic approach to the environment that was the focal point of society at one point. How the Indigenous people obtained water quality is only one of the changes in society. The Aboriginal peoples were expected to resume previous cultural practices 100 years later, despite a geographical and cultural displacement without the necessary resources to foster a self-sustainable lifestyle. First Nations communities are supplied housing and land with expectations to become autonomous with occasional maintenance on the provided water treatment plants. Severe legal mandates need to be executed to support Canada's objective of eliminating all water-related viruses by 2021. Unfortunately, these Aboriginal communities are facing such abject poverty that there is no one to facilitate funding of any legal implications for the province or federal government. As of 2012, the Canadian government has recognized the right to safe drinking water on the international stage. They joined the consensus of the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development and are quoted, "Canada recognizes the human right of everyone to safe drinking water and basic sanitation as essential to the right to an adequate standard of living. Water and sanitation services should be physically and economically accessible on equal and non-discriminatory basis. Recognizing that water is integral to sustainable development in economic, social, and environmental faculties of life, but not addressing it in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, allows for leniency in many of these marginalized Indigenous communities. Judging by the statement on an international platform, Aboriginal rights and legal traditions should no longer be at risk. However, by law, the provincial government does not have to allocate funding to provide sufficient water quality to the Indigenous communities. Only cities under provincial jurisdiction are legally required to be continuously monitored by the government. Furthermore, in 2016, Canadian legislation reneged the decision to adopt principles into the Charter. The government, whether provincial or federal, needs to be held accountable for not implementing proper water quality into the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In Section 9124 of the Constitution Act 1867, the federal government assumed legal responsibility for Indians and lands reserved for Indians. In the White Paper, 1969, Section 3, it is quoted that services come through the same channels and from the same government agencies for all Canadians. In Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982, Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are recognized and affirmed. Where is Canada coming up short? The federal government is not allocating enough money to properly maintain and implement thorough water treatment faculties across the First Nation communities as a whole. The Parliamentary Budget Officer is responsible for publishing public reports and states the current financial status of the water crisis. As quoted by Carol Tooney, the Liberal government is spending only 70% at most of what it is needed to fulfill its promise. Thursday's report says Ottawa will need to invest a minimum of $3.2 billion in capital investment to bring First Nations water systems up to standards of comparable non-Indigenous communities in order to eliminate boil water advisories. This graph represents Canada's projection for the next 3 years. Despite publicly admitting funding is insufficient to meet this trajectory of water advisories in Canada, the government still holds its claim that 2021 will mark the year advisories will reduce to zero. This graph has been updated since 2018 to reflect the actual changes that have occurred up until May 31st. but the challenge remains to prevent future advisories from occurring and reoccurring. The money required to prevent advisories long term is far more significant than what is allocated right now. While some of these lifts on water advisories may last 4 to 5 years, they are not indefinite. The indigenous communities are concerned with the longevity and sustainability of their water treatment facilities. Present shortcomings are attributed to the loopholes in budget allocations where First Nations communities may be omitted from the government watch list. One example being Cat Lake First Nation, which has declared a state of housing emergency and the federal government has deemed their housing inhabitable, refusing to implement water strategies in an area where housing is not suitable. However, this community was subject to inadequate housing ultimately as a result of the federal government, so the onus should be on no one other. There have been advisories lifted in Cat Lake, but much like the town does not receive public funding, and there has been a boil water advisory since 2007. About 180 homes in the community lack running water and indoor plumbing. Data provided by Indigenous Service Canada show that the water in 30% of the cisterns tested in Garden Hill did not meet national safety standards. In neighboring Wasagamak, 3/4 of the cisterns contained fecal bacteria, an indication the water could be contaminated with a variety of bacteria such as E. coli. When a review of Garden Hill is underway, it is unlikely that the homes without running water and indoor plumbing that were not retrofitted under a program that started in 2012 will be part of this review. Premier John Horgan says BC's legislative commitment is not dependent on what happens at the federal level. As of February 13th, 2019, he is quoted, "We're proceeding regardless. We have within our jurisdiction a whole host of areas that we can take action, and we're going to do that." This represents significant importance for the Indigenous communities because adopting what Canada has initially claimed it was planning to do in 2007 will set the stage for cultural life in the Indigenous communities and foster the platform for proper reconciliation. Hogan said he'll be looking for how the province is going to recognize the jurisdiction and authority of First Nations across BC, and also provisions that ensure economic benefits flow to the communities if activities are going to take place in their tidal lands and traditional territories. He is quoted stating, "For too long, uncertainty on the land base has led to investment decisions being foregone, and I believe that hurts Indigenous people and it hurts other British Columbians. There have been too many gray areas in the past that have incited conflict between industries and the First Nations communities across Canada. With BC's promise, the Indigenous communities will be given more autonomy, but also reap more benefits if they chose to host or allow industrial work on their land. While this does not directly concern water standards, it concerns Indigenous communities as a whole and their basic human rights. Water quality is a basic human right that has yet to be recognized at the provincial level for Indigenous communities. Honoring the UNDRIP will require the BC provincial government to remedy any water advisories remaining in British Columbia." Bob Chamberlain said the BC legislation could have an impact on the whole range of areas quoted from land use planning to forestry, mining, oil and gas, and so forth. This is the type of legislation that needs to be implemented nationwide. Not enough is being done at the federal level, but if other provinces can emulate BC, there is a chance for the 2021 goal not only to be achieved, but be sustained. BC is the first province that is truly honoring the UNDRIP and upholding what Canada as a whole promised to the world and Indigenous communities in 2012. While progress may seem to be improving as a whole, there are communities that are not receiving adequate attention due to external reasons. Government is justifying certain towns in omission from studies, lack of treatment due to inadequate housing, and unfitting locations for proper treatment are all reasons. While there is the possibility mandates change in the next 2 years before 2021, the progression of this 5-year plan had not proved viable thus far, and more significant legislation needs to follow BC's adoption of the UNDRIP.